Join me as I explore a heartwarming adoption hearing and uncover the reason why the judge was completely stunned. The autumn morning cast a pale light through the tall windows of Courtroom 7A. Strips of sunlight filtered through the Venetian blinds, stretching across the worn carpet like quiet witnesses to the decisions that had unfolded in this room. Outside, leaves in shades of amber and crimson swirled gently in the crisp air, their muted dance visible through the spotless window panes. Inside, the room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each sound echoing the weight of the day ahead. The polished oak benches gleamed faintly, their surfaces cool and unyielding. The air carried a faint blend of wood polish and paper, an unmistakable scent of formality and purpose. The stillness of the room, broken only by the occasional rustle of a document or the shifting of a chair, seemed to magnify the gravity of what was to come. The halls of justice stood ready, waiting for the truth to unfold. 8-year-old Tommy Wilson sat rigidly in an oversized wooden chair, his small frame dwarfed by its imposing size. His feet, clad in slightly scuffed sneakers, dangled above the floor, swinging gently in an unconscious rhythm. Beside him sat Ms. Jennifer Parker, his social worker, her calm demeanor attempting to provide a sense of comfort. Yet even her reassuring presence couldn't completely mask the concern etched across her face as she glanced at the boy. Tommy clutched his faded backpack tightly against his chest, as if it were a shield protecting him from the daunting world around him. The worn fabric and frayed straps told silent stories of the life he had carried with him from place to place. His fingers nervously traced the edge of his too large sweater, the loose threads a testament to the many hands-me-down he had grown used to wearing. Ms. Parker occasionally placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, hoping to ground him amidst the formalities of the courtroom. Her open case file rested on her lap, filled with dates, reports, and evaluations that tried to encapsulate the complexity of his young life. Tommy's wide brown eyes flitted from the clock on the wall to the empty seat at the judge's bench, then back to his backpack. He said nothing, but the way he held onto that bag spoke volumes, as if it contained not just his belongings, but the only pieces of his world that still felt like home. Tommy clutched his worn backpack tightly against his chest, its faded fabric and frayed straps pressed firmly beneath his small hands. It was more than just a bag to him. It was a safe haven, a place where the few tangible pieces of his past were kept. His fingers traced the edges of the zipper as his mind unwillingly drifted back to the night that had changed everything. He could still hear the screech of tires, the sudden blinding headlights, and the deafening crash that seemed to shatter not just the car, but his entire world. The memory came in fragments, like broken shards of glass, his mother's voice calling his name, his father's comforting hand reaching back to hold his own. Then, silence. A silence so complete and so terrifying that it still haunted him in the quietest moments. Tommy squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the images away, but they clung stubbornly to the edges of his mind. He could feel the cold rain on his face as he sat on the roadside that night, wrapped in a blanket a stranger had handed him. His parents' absence was like a physical weight pressing down on his chest, leaving a hollow ache that no words could fill. Inside the backpack, wrapped carefully in his mother's scarf, was the last family photograph they had taken, 3 smiling faces at the park just days before the accident. Tommy's grip on the bag tightened. The backpack wasn't just holding his possessions, it was holding his memories, his connection to the life he had lost, and the love he so desperately wanted to keep alive. Judge Harris sat behind his desk, his silver-rimmed glasses balanced on the tip of his nose as he studied the case file before him. The lines on his face deepened with each page he read, his expression a blend of focus and concern. His pen tapped lightly on the polished wood, a quiet rhythm breaking the heavy silence of the courtroom. The file detailed Tommy Wilson's troubled journey, foster homes, emotional struggles, and the profound loss of his parents. The Petersons' glowing assessments offered stability and opportunity, while Mrs. Wilson's letters spoke of love and familiarity. Judge Harris paused, removing his glasses to rub his eyes, his mind weighed down by the decision ahead. His gaze shifted to Tommy, sitting small and quiet with his backpack clutched tightly. The judge exhaled slowly. This was more than a legal matter. It was a child's future, and the gravity of it filled the room. The Petersons sat confidently on the right side of the courtroom, their polished appearance radiating an air of assurance. Mr. Peterson, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, sat with his back straight, his posture exuding authority. His hands rested casually on the armrests of his chair, but his occasional glance at his watch betrayed a subtle impatience. Beside him, Mrs. Peterson adjusted the folds of her cream designer dress, the pearls around her neck glinting softly in the morning light. She maintained a serene smile, her composed demeanor reflecting the poise of someone accustomed to being in control. Their attorney, Mr. Richardson, sat beside them with a meticulously organized briefcase, its contents arranged with military precision. He occasionally leaned in to whisper something to Mr. Peterson, who nodded with practiced calm. A stack of documents lay before them, financial statements, character references, and home evaluations, all neatly prepared to showcase their capability as the ideal family. The Petersons exchanged knowing glances, their matching wedding bands catching the sunlight streaming through the blinds. They projected a united front, their expressions a blend of calculated warmth and confidence. Their presence seemed to suggest that the outcome of the hearing was already a foregone conclusion, as if their success was simply a matter of course. In their minds, they were the answer to Tommy's future, a vision of stability and prosperity wrapped in an image of perfection. Mrs. Wilson sat quietly on a bench near the back of the courtroom, her small frame almost blending into the shadowy corners of the room. She wore a simple, worn dress, carefully cleaned and pressed, a testament to her dignity despite modest means. Her silver hair was neatly combed, reflecting her effort to present herself with care and respect. Her weathered hands rested in her lap, fingers clasping and unclasping nervously as her eyes remained fixed on Tommy. Though her posture was humble, there was an unshakable resolve in her gaze, a quiet strength born from years of hard work and love. She clutched a small purse, her only possession in the courtroom, and occasionally glanced down at it as if gathering courage from within. Despite her modest appearance, Mrs. Wilson's presence exuded a warmth and sincerity that filled the space around her, a stark contrast to the polished confidence of the Petersons. The Petersons sat with composed confidence as their attorney, Mr. Richardson, began presenting their case. His voice was steady and persuasive, highlighting the couple's ability to provide Tommy Wilson with the stability, opportunities, and care he needed. "Your Honor," he began, "the Petersons are uniquely equipped to offer Tommy a life filled with security, education, and emotional support." Mr. Peterson leaned forward slightly, his hands resting firmly on the table. Dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded calm assurance. "We live in a spacious 5,000 square foot home in Maple Grove," he explained. "Tommy will have his own bedroom, already decorated to reflect his interest in space and astronomy. There's also a large backyard where he can play safely and enjoy the outdoors." Mrs. Peterson nodded in agreement, her demeanor warm yet polished. "We've already taken steps to enroll him in Westbrook Academy, one of the top private schools in the state," she added. "He'll benefit from an excellent education, alongside extracurricular activities like sports, music, and science clubs, all designed to nurture his potential." Mr. Richardson held up a neatly organized stack of documents, flipping through them deliberately. "In addition to a nurturing environment, the Petersons have a solid financial foundation. They've established a college fund for Tommy, and they're prepared to cover all his medical and developmental needs. Every detail has been considered to ensure his future is secure." The couple exchanged a brief glance, their unity apparent in their synchronized gestures. Mrs. Peterson added with a genuine tone, "Tommy deserves the best, and we're committed to providing him with a home where he can thrive emotionally and academically." As Mr. Richardson concluded, the presentation felt deliberate and precise, emphasizing the Petersons' readiness to offer Tommy not only comfort, but also success. The courtroom remained silent, absorbing the polished assurance they exuded, as though their carefully chosen words had already decided the case. Ms. Jennifer Parker, the social worker assigned to Tommy Wilson's case, rose from her seat, holding a worn leather folder filled with the boy's history. Her expression was calm but tinged with concern as she addressed the courtroom. "Your Honor, Tommy has faced more challenges in his 8 years than most adults experience in a lifetime," she began. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her words filled the room. After the tragic loss of his parents 18 months ago, Tommy entered the foster care system, where he has struggled to find a sense of stability and belonging. She opened the folder, pulling out a series of carefully documented reports. Tommy's first placement was with the Warrens, a family that provided material comfort but struggled to meet his emotional needs. While there, Tommy exhibited signs of withdrawal and isolation. Teachers reported he stopped participating in class discussions and often chose to spend recess drawing alone. His attempts to connect were met with indifference, leaving him feeling like an outsider in their home. Ms. Parker paused, her gaze shifting momentarily to Tommy, who sat clutching his backpack. His second placement was with the Reynolds family. Initially, it appeared promising, but further investigation revealed significant concerns. The Reynolds family frequently featured Tommy in their social media content without consent, using him to build an online following. Tommy's support payments were diverted for personal expenses, and his emotional well-being was overlooked. During this time, Tommy's academic performance declined, and he developed trouble sleeping. She flipped to another page in her notes. Throughout both placements, Tommy's art therapy sessions revealed recurring themes of loneliness and fear. His drawings often depicted himself separated from others by walls or large distances. He carried all his possessions in his backpack, never unpacking fully, which indicates a lack of security or a sense of permanence. Her voice softened as she continued. Tommy's journey through the foster care system has been marked by instability, loss, and a profound longing for connection. He has endured environments where his emotional needs were neglected in favor of appearances. Despite this, he remains a resilient, kind-hearted child who longs for a place where he can simply be himself. Ms. Parker closed her folder, her voice resolute. Tommy deserves a home where he is more than just a responsibility or a project. He deserves a family that sees him for who he is and provides the unconditional love and stability he so desperately needs. The room fell silent, the gravity of her report weighing heavily on all present. Judge Harris leaned forward, his eyes kind yet serious as he addressed the small boy sitting quietly in his chair. "Tommy," he began, his voice steady and calm, "we've heard from a lot of people today about what they think is best for you. But now I'd like to hear from you. What do you think? How do you feel about living with the Petersons? Or with your grandmother?" Tommy's small fingers tightened around the straps of his backpack. He looked down, his feet swinging slightly above the floor, the weight of the question pressing on his young shoulders. The room was silent, every eye focused on him. He glanced up briefly, meeting the judge's gaze, and then spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't want to live with the Petersons," he said, his words tentative at first but gaining strength. "They have a big house and nice things, but it doesn't feel like home. I've been to houses like that before. I didn't belong there." Judge Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And what about your grandmother, Tommy? How do you feel about living with her?" Tommy's grip on his backpack softened slightly. His voice grew stronger, tinged with emotion. "Gran doesn't have a big house, but it feels safe. She lets me talk about Mom and Dad. She doesn't ask me to be someone I'm not. When I'm with her, I don't have to pretend. I can just be me." The judge leaned back, his gaze steady. "Thank you, Tommy," he said warmly. "What you've shared is very important, and we'll keep it in mind as we make this decision." Tommy nodded slightly, the relief visible in his eyes, knowing his voice had been heard. The courtroom was silent as Judge Harris gently leaned forward. "Tommy," he said softly, "this is your chance to tell us what you truly want. Don't worry about saying the right thing. Just speak from your heart." Tommy's small hands gripped the straps of his backpack tightly. He looked down, his feet dangling above the floor, his sneakers swinging slightly. The weight of the question felt immense, but he took a deep breath and looked up, his wide brown eyes meeting the judge's. "I want to go home," he said, his voice quiet but firm, the words carrying a depth of emotion that silenced even the faint whispers in the room. Judge Harris nodded gently, encouraging him to continue. "And where is home, Tommy?" Tommy's fingers tightened around his backpack, and his voice trembled slightly, but he pressed on. "Home is with Gran," he said, his tone growing stronger. "Gran makes soup for me when I'm sick, just like Mom used to. She knows I don't like crusts on my sandwiches. Not because she read it in a file, but because she knows me. His voice cracked slightly, but he continued, clutching the scarf from his backpack. With Gran, I don't have to pretend. I don't have to smile for anyone or do things I don't want to do. I can be sad about mom and dad without someone telling me to move on. Tommy's eyes glistened with tears as he looked back at Judge Harris. I just want to be me, and I want to go home with Gran. The room remained still, the weight of his words hanging in the air, raw and unfiltered, cutting through all the arguments and polished presentations that had come before. In that moment, Tommy's truth was undeniable. Tommy remembered the Warrens' mansion as a cold, unwelcoming place, despite its grandeur. The house was enormous, with towering ceilings and gleaming marble floors that echoed every step he took. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom, where everything was designed to impress, but nothing was meant to be touched. His bedroom was a perfect example. The walls were painted with bright, cheerful stars, and the bed was shaped like a rocket ship, a dream for any child. But it felt more like a set piece than a place to rest. The toys were lined up neatly on shelves never played with, and the bed was always made so perfectly that Tommy was afraid to mess it up. Meals were equally isolating. Tommy often sat alone at the end of a long dining table, his quiet chewing drowned out by the ticking of the ornate grandfather clock. The Warrens rarely joined him, citing their busy schedules, and Mrs. Warren's strict rules about table manners made even eating feel like a chore. Despite the luxury, the mansion lacked warmth. There were no hugs, no laughter, no sense of love. Tommy felt invisible, a decoration in a house built for show, not for life. Tommy's mealtimes at the Warrens' mansion were some of the loneliest moments he experienced. The dining room was enormous, with a table that stretched far longer than necessary for 3 people. Most evenings, Tommy sat alone at one end, his plate set neatly in front of him, while the rest of the chairs remained empty. The ornate chandelier cast a cold, sterile light over the pristine china and silverware, amplifying the vast emptiness of the space. Mrs. Warren's rules were strict. Sit up straight, no elbows on the table. And chew quietly, she would remind him before disappearing to handle important matters. Dinner for Tommy became a solitary routine of silence and clinking utensils. He wasn't allowed to ask questions, speak out of turn, or even hum to himself. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, its rhythm marking the slow passage of time. Occasionally, he would hear muffled laughter from another part of the house where the Warrens dined later, enjoying their evening without him. Tommy often picked at his food, wondering why they didn't eat together. In that grand, beautifully decorated dining room, surrounded by wealth and luxury, he felt completely invisible. At the Warrens' mansion, emotions were treated like imperfections to be smoothed out. Much like the pristine marble floors, Tommy quickly learned that expressing feelings was unwelcome. Proper children don't cry, Mr. Warren had told him sternly on his first night there when Tommy sobbed quietly in his room, overwhelmed by the loss of his parents. Laughter was equally discouraged unless it was subdued and controlled. "Indoor voices, dear," Mrs. Warren would say whenever Tommy let out an unrestrained giggle. Her calm, detached tone carried an unspoken warning that any deviation from their polished image would not be tolerated. Even sadness, the overwhelming ache he carried daily, had to be hidden. When Tommy once tried to tell Mrs. Warren that he missed his parents, she dismissed him briskly, saying, "Dwelling on the past doesn't help anyone, Tommy." Tommy learned to bottle his emotions, suppressing tears when he was hurt and forcing small, polite smiles when required. At night, he buried his face into his pillow, laughing or crying as softly as possible so no one would hear. Over time, he felt his true feelings slipping further away, replaced by the cold, measured demeanor expected of him in a house that valued appearances over authenticity. At the Warrens' mansion, Tommy often felt more like a decoration than a child. He was dressed in carefully selected outfits, positioned in family photos like an accessory meant to enhance the image of perfection. "Stand up straight, Tommy. Smile properly," Mrs. Warren would instruct during photo shoots, her tone devoid of warmth. Visitors would coo over him, commenting on how well-behaved he seemed, but no one truly noticed him. He wasn't allowed to touch the expensive furniture or play with the pristine toys that filled his room. Tommy felt like one of the glass ornaments on their shelves, pretty to look at but utterly untouchable. Ms. Parker opened Tommy's journal, its cover worn and corners bent from use. Her voice was soft as she began to read aloud, the words written in a shaky, childlike scrawl. Day 15, Mrs. Warren told me to sit still for the family photo today. I smiled like she wanted, but it didn't feel real. She said my other smiles looked fake. How do I smile when I don't feel happy? Day 27, I tried to play with the toy cars in my room today. Mrs. Warren walked in and said I shouldn't mess up the arrangement. I put them back and sat quietly. The cars aren't for playing, I guess. Day 34. Dinner was lonely again tonight. I ate by myself at the big table. The food was good, but it didn't taste like Grand's. I tried to talk to Mrs. Warren about missing Mom and Dad, but she said I should focus on the future, not the past. Day 42. I laughed at something funny on TV today. Mrs. Warren told me to keep my voice down. I didn't laugh again. It's quieter here than I thought a home would be. The courtroom was silent as the words hung in the air, each entry a glimpse into Tommy's world of isolation and yearning. Judge Harris leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm as he addressed Tommy. Tommy, he began, his gaze steady, I know this has been a hard day for you. We've heard a lot about what you've been through, and it's clear how strong you are. But I want you to think about something. He gestured toward the Petersons, sitting quietly with calm, confident expressions. The Petersons want to give you a fresh start. They have a big house with a room just for you, decorated with the things you love. They've made plans for your education, activities, and even little things like piano lessons and museum trips. They believe in giving you every opportunity to grow and succeed. His voice softened, his tone more encouraging. Sometimes starting over can be hard, but it can also help us heal. The Petersons have offered to give you a home where you'll have everything you need to feel safe and supported. They've made a commitment to you, Tommy, because they care about your future. He paused, meeting Tommy's eyes. What do you think about that, Tommy? Could this be a chance for you to find happiness again? His words hung in the air, leaving space for Tommy to respond. Tommy's mind drifted back to the Reynolds promises, words that had once filled him with hope, but now felt hollow. We'll make everything better, sweetie, Mrs. Reynolds had said, her camera-ready smile unwavering. You'll be part of a real family, and everyone will see how much we care. At first, the words sounded comforting, but they soon unraveled. He remembered the rehearsed hugs, the staged smiles for their videos, and the empty gifts that were more props than presents. Every promise of love and belonging was tied to the perfect image they wanted to create, leaving Tommy feeling more like an actor than a son. The Reynolds social media feed was a picture-perfect showcase of family joy. Each post was carefully curated, filtered, and captioned to present their lives as an ideal blend of love, success, and happiness. Welcome to #The Reynolds Family Joy. Their bio read, accompanied by a follower count in the millions. Photos of Tommy were prominently featured. Pancake breakfasts with artfully arranged berries, cozy movie nights under plush blankets, and smiling family outings to parks and museums. The images told a story of harmony, but Tommy knew the reality behind the lens. The spontaneous moments were rehearsed over and over until they looked just right. His first day in his new room was filmed 3 times to capture the perfect reaction. A photo of him happily baking cookies with Mrs. Reynolds was staged with store-bought dough just outside the frame. Videos of Tommy, scripted and edited to perfection, garnered thousands of likes and comments. Such a happy family, people would say. But Tommy didn't feel the joy portrayed on screen. Behind the glamour, the Reynolds life was all about appearances. Every smile was planned, every laugh directed, leaving Tommy to wonder if the love they showed online was as real as it seemed. The courtroom screen flickered to life as Ms. Parker played a video from the Reynolds social media account, titled A Foster Child's Journey to Joy. The opening shot showed Tommy sitting on a sunlit windowsill, gazing thoughtfully out at the garden. The soft glow of golden hour light bathed his face, making the scene look almost ethereal. A gentle piano melody played in the background as a voiceover began, scripted to perfection. Before the Reynolds, I was lost, Tommy's recorded voice said, carefully edited to sound reflective. The camera cut to staged moments. Mr. Reynolds helping Tommy with homework at the dining table. Mrs. Reynolds teaching him to bake cookies with pre-made dough neatly out of view. And the family cuddled under a blanket on their white couch, watching movies. The video transitioned to clips of Tommy unwrapping presents and smiling brightly. "Now I feel like I belong," the voiceover continued. Applause erupted in the online comments below the post, praising the Reynolds for their kindness and generosity. But as the video played, Ms. Parker revealed a portion of the raw footage. The cheerful scene of Tommy laughing while reading a book with Mr. Reynolds was interrupted by Mrs. Reynolds' sharp voice off camera. "Tommy, more emotion. Think about sad puppies if you have to," she directed. Another take showed Tommy hesitating as he recited his scripted lines, only for Mrs. Reynolds to insist, "If we hit 1,000,000 views, you can call your grandmother." "Just one more time, honey." The polished final video faded from the screen, replaced by the courtroom silence. The stark contrast between the perfect family portrayed online and the reality behind the scenes left a heavy impression, highlighting how even Tommy's most vulnerable moments had been turned into a marketing strategy. Ms. Parker stood before the courtroom, holding a stack of documents that detailed a troubling financial pattern in the Reynolds household. Clearing her throat, she began, her tone firm yet professional. "Your Honor, the evidence I am about to present highlights a significant misuse of foster care funds meant for Tommy's well-being." She placed the first document on the overhead projector, revealing a breakdown of the monthly foster care payments allocated to the Reynolds family. The state provided $897 per month to the Reynolds family to cover Tommy's expenses, including food, clothing, education, and medical needs, she explained. However, our investigation shows that these funds were redirected to a separate bank account labeled Social Media Development. The courtroom murmured as Ms. Parker continued. This account was used to purchase high-end video equipment, including professional-grade cameras, lighting setups, and editing software. Invoices also reveal recurring subscriptions to social media growth services and ad promotions to boost the visibility of their family videos. Meanwhile, records show minimal spending on Tommy's actual needs. School supplies, clothing, and healthcare expenses accounted for less than 10% of the funds. Ms. Parker displayed another document, a spreadsheet of earnings from the Reynolds social media account. There are videos featuring Tommy generated between $5,000 to $25,000 per post, thanks to sponsorship deals and ad revenue. One specific video titled "A Foster Child's Journey to Joy" brought in over $50,000 in brand partnerships. She paused, her expression grim. While the Reynolds profited significantly from their portrayal of a healing family, Tommy's basic needs were neglected. He reported wearing secondhand clothes that no longer fit and struggling to keep up with schoolwork due to a lack of proper supplies. Furthermore, Tommy's emotional well-being was compromised, as many of these videos required him to perform and reenact emotionally charged moments under the guise of authenticity. As the final piece of evidence, Ms. Parker held up a printed email exchange. Mrs. Reynolds wrote to her social media manager stating, "We need to maintain the narrative tension in Tommy's story. Overcoming sadness sells better than day-to-day happiness." This proves their primary focus was on monetizing Tommy's experiences rather than ensuring his stability or growth. She concluded, her voice resolute. The foster care payments were intended to support Tommy, not fund a social media empire. This financial exploitation highlights the Reynolds' disregard for their responsibilities as foster parents and their failure to provide Tommy with the care and security he desperately needed. The weight of her words lingered, casting a stark light on the misuse of trust and resources. Ms. Parker stepped forward with a somber expression, holding a set of documents and communication records. "Your Honor," she began, her voice firm but laced with compassion. Another troubling aspect of Tommy's time with the Reynolds was the systematic prevention of his contact with Mrs. Wilson, his grandmother. She displayed phone records on the courtroom's screen. Here, we see dozens of attempted calls from Mrs. Wilson to Tommy during his time with the Reynolds. All of them were blocked or ignored. Tommy later reported that every time he asked to speak to his grandmother, he was told it wasn't a good time. Ms. Parker turned to a printed email exchange between Mrs. Reynolds and her social media manager. In this email, Mrs. Reynolds explicitly wrote, "Maintaining emotional distance from the grandmother is crucial for bonding and building the narrative of Tommy's journey with us. Sad grandma calls don't get views. Happy healing does." This decision was not based on Tommy's well-being, but rather on their desire to maintain a curated image. She held up a copy of a handwritten letter Tommy had attempted to send to his grandmother. Tommy wrote this letter, but it was never mailed. He tucked it away in his backpack after Mrs. Reynolds told him, "Talking to your grandmother won't help you move forward." The letter describes his longing to see Mrs. Wilson and how much he missed her cooking, her hugs, and the way she helped him remember his parents. It's a clear testament to the bond he shares with her. The evidence grew heavier as Ms. Parker presented another document. When Mrs. Wilson tried to send Tommy a birthday gift, it was intercepted. Mrs. Reynolds explained to Tommy that gifts from his grandmother were unnecessary because everything he needed was already provided. Finally, Ms. Parker shared one more piece of evidence, a video of Tommy asking, off camera, when he could visit his grandmother. Mrs. Reynolds' voice responded curtly, "When the time is right, focus on your new family now." Ms. Parker looked directly at Judge Harris. Tommy's emotional connection to his grandmother was deliberately severed to serve the Reynolds' interests. This act not only isolated him further, but also robbed him of the one person who truly understood and loved him unconditionally. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Tommy sat quietly in his oversized chair, his small hands gripping the straps of his worn backpack as if it were the only thing anchoring him. The courtroom felt impossibly large and silent, every gaze fixed on him. Judge Harris leaned forward, his voice calm and encouraging. "Tommy, you've been very brave today. We've heard from a lot of people about what they think is best for you, but now it's your turn. I want to hear what you truly feel. Don't worry about saying the right thing. Just speak from your heart." Tommy's chest tightened and his eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on the judge. He took a deep breath, the words bubbling up from a place he'd kept hidden for so long. "I don't want a big house or fancy toys," he began, his voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. "I don't want to be in videos or pictures where I have to smile when I don't feel happy. I don't want to be someone's project to fix." He paused, looking down at his lap, where his fingers fidgeted with the frayed edge of his backpack. "At the Warrens, I was supposed to be the perfect kid in their perfect house. At the Reynolds, I was the sad kid who was supposed to get better for their videos. But I wasn't better, I was just pretending." Tommy looked back at Judge Harris, his voice gaining strength. "Gran doesn't make me pretend. She doesn't tell me to stop being sad about Mom and Dad. She lets me talk about them. She listens. She just lets me be me." Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't look away. "Gran doesn't have a big house or lots of money, but she has love. When I'm with her, I feel safe. I feel like I belong. I don't have to act or be someone I'm not. I can just be Tommy." The room fell into a profound silence as his words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Tommy wiped at his eyes, clutching his backpack tighter. "I just want to go home, Your Honor. Home with Gran." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, but the truth in them was undeniable. The quiet strength of his plea left everyone in the courtroom deeply moved, the weight of his sincerity impossible to ignore. Tommy sat quietly, his small frame hunched over his worn backpack. His fingers fumbled with the zipper, hesitant yet determined. The courtroom was silent, every eye on him as he carefully opened the bag that had been his constant companion through so many transitions. Slowly, he pulled out a faded woolen scarf, its colors muted from years of use. He held it up gently, the fabric draping over his small hands as if it were a treasure. "This is my mom's scarf," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wore it every winter. Gran helped her knit it when she was learning." Tommy brought the scarf close to his face, inhaling deeply. His eyes glistened as he continued. "It still smells like her, like cookies she baked and the lavender soap she always used. It makes me feel like she's still here, just a little." His hands trembled slightly as he reached back into the bag, pulling out a crumpled photograph. The edges were worn and the colors had faded, but the image was unmistakable. A family of three, smiling brightly at the camera. Tommy smoothed it carefully against his lap. "This is the last picture we took together," he said, his voice cracking. "Mom, Dad, and me. It was at the park 3 days before the accident." Tommy looked at the photograph, his fingers tracing the outlines of his parents. "I keep it in my backpack so I can have them with me. It's all I have left of them. It reminds me of home, of what it felt like to be loved." The scarf and photograph, simple yet profound, were more than just objects. They were his connection to a past he refused to let go of. Tommy held the scarf and photograph tightly in his hands, his small fingers gently tracing their edges. He looked down at them, his voice trembling but filled with quiet determination. "These aren't just things," he began softly. "They're my family. They remind me of Mom and Dad, of what it felt like to have them with me. The scarf isn't just a piece of cloth, it's like a hug from Mom. She wore it every winter, and Gran helped her knit it. It smells like cookies she used to bake and the lavender soap she washed my hair with. It's the only thing that still feels like her." He held up the photograph, smoothing the worn edges with care. "And this picture," he continued, "is the last time we were all together. Mom, Dad, and me at the park. We were laughing so much that day. When I look at this, I can still hear Dad's laugh and feel Mom's arms around me. It reminds me of how safe and loved I felt." Tommy looked up, his voice steady now. "These aren't just objects. They're my memories, my heart. They're the only pieces of home I have left." Tommy clutched the scarf and photograph to his chest, his small frame trembling with the weight of his emotions. His voice, though soft, carried a conviction far beyond his years as he looked up at Judge Harris. "Gran's apartment is small," he began, his eyes glistening with tears. "It doesn't have a big yard or fancy furniture, but it feels like home. It smells like cookies when she bakes, and it's warm, even when it's cold outside. Gran lets me be myself. She doesn't ask me to pretend to be happy or tell me to stop being sad about Mom and Dad." He paused, taking a shaky breath, his grip on the scarf tightening. "She talks to me about them. She tells me stories about when Mom was my age, and she helps me remember the good things, the things that make me smile even when I feel like crying." Tommy's voice grew stronger as he continued, his words filled with longing. "When I'm with Gran, I don't feel alone. She knows me, not from a file or a list, but because she's my Gran. She doesn't need big houses or new toys to show me she loves me. She just does." He looked directly at Judge Harris, his small hands trembling but steady. "I don't need anything else, Your Honor. I just want to go home. Home with Gran. She's my family, and with her, I feel safe. That's all I want." The sincerity in his voice filled the room, his quiet plea cutting through all the arguments and polished words that had come before. Tommy's longing for the love and safety of his grandmother was undeniable, his words leaving an indelible mark on everyone who heard them. Judge Harris turned his attention to Mrs. Wilson, who sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward, his tone measured yet kind. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, "you've clearly played a significant role in Tommy's life, and it's obvious how much he loves you. But as a court, we must ensure that any arrangement is in Tommy's best interest. May I ask you a few questions?" Mrs. Wilson straightened her posture, her small frame exuding a quiet strength. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. The judge nodded. "Tommy is a growing boy with many needs, educational, emotional, and financial. Do you feel confident that you're able to meet all of these needs given your current circumstances?" Mrs. Wilson took a deep breath, clasping her hands tightly. "Your Honor, I won't pretend it's going to be easy. I'm not a wealthy woman, and I don't live in a big house. But I've raised a family before, and I know how to make the most of what I have. Tommy doesn't need riches. He needs love, stability, and someone who truly knows him. I can give him that." Judge Harris regarded her thoughtfully before continuing. "Raising a young child, especially one who's been through trauma, can be physically and emotionally demanding. Are you prepared for that responsibility at this stage of your life?" Mrs. Wilson's voice grew firmer. "I may be older, Your Honor, but Tommy gives me strength. He's my reason to stay healthy and keep going every day." He's not just a responsibility to me, he's my family. I've been there for him through the worst moments of his life, and I'll be there for him for every moment after. The judge leaned back slightly, his pen tapping lightly against his desk. Tommy will also need access to counseling, a structured education, and resources to help him recover and grow. How do you plan to ensure he receives these, Borisum? Mrs. Wilson nodded. I've already spoken to my church and my neighbors. They've offered support, whether it's tutoring, transportation, or just lending a hand when I need it. I've also saved up enough to ensure Tommy has access to counseling. He's been through so much, and I want him to have all the help he needs to heal. Judge Harris studied her for a moment, his expression softening. Mrs. Wilson, what makes you certain that you're the best choice for Tommy's future? Her voice broke slightly but remained steady. Because I know him, Your Honor. I've known him since the day he was born. I know what makes him smile, what makes him scared, and how to comfort him when he's hurting. Tommy doesn't need a perfect house or a perfect life. He needs a home where he's loved for who he is, not for who someone wants him to be. That's what I can give him. The courtroom was silent as her words settled, filled with quiet conviction and unwavering love. Judge Harris nodded slowly, the weight of her testimony clear in his expression. The courtroom was silent as Judge Harris turned to Tommy. The young boy sat on the oversized wooden chair, his small feet dangling above the floor, but his presence filled the room with a quiet strength. Judge Harris leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle. Tommy, you've shown great courage today. I have one more question for you. You've been through a lot, and choosing where to live is a big decision. Can you tell us why you think staying with your grandmother is the best choice? Tommy looked down at his backpack, clutching it tightly for a moment, then raised his gaze to meet the judge's. His voice, though soft, carried a remarkable clarity and resolve. Your Honor, I know Gran doesn't have a big house or a lot of money, he began, but those things don't matter to me. I've lived in places with big rooms and fancy toys, but I never felt like I belonged. With Gran, I feel safe. I don't have to pretend to be happy when I'm not. I can just be me. He paused, taking a deep breath. I know living with Gran might not be easy. Maybe I won't have everything other kids have, but I can help. I can do my homework by myself. I can help Gran with cooking and cleaning. I've learned a lot over the past year. I know how to take care of myself, and I know I can help take care of her too. Tommy's voice grew stronger as he continued. Gran doesn't just give me a place to live. She gives me love. She lets me talk about Mom and Dad and doesn't tell me to stop. She tells me stories about them, about when they were young, and she helps me remember. With her, I feel like I have a home. The sincerity in his words left the courtroom silent. Even the Petersons exchanged uneasy glances, unable to deny the depth of Tommy's love for his grandmother. Mrs. Wilson, sitting at the back of the courtroom, wiped her eyes with a trembling hand before standing. Her small frame seemed almost dwarfed by the grandeur of the courtroom, but her voice was steady as she spoke. Your Honor, she began, Tommy is not just my grandson, he's my heart. I've loved him since the day he was born, and I will love him every day after. Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. I know I'm not rich, and I know I'm not young anymore, but I know what Tommy needs. He needs love, patience, and a home where he can be himself. He's been through so much, and I can't erase his pain, but I can give him a place where he feels safe and loved. She turned toward Tommy, her eyes brimming with tears. Tommy, you've always been my joy. I may not have everything, but I will give you all that I have. Together we can build a home filled with love, laughter, and the memories of your mom and dad. The room was filled with emotion as her words settled. The unshakable bond between Tommy and Mrs. Wilson was clear, a love that neither time nor circumstances could diminish. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harris delivered his final decision, his voice steady yet filled with warmth. After careful consideration of all the evidence and testimonies, I find that the best place for Tommy Wilson is with his grandmother, Mrs. Wilson. Her unwavering love, deep understanding of Tommy, and commitment to his well-being provide the foundation of a true home. Tommy's eyes widened as the words sank in, A moment later, he was out of his chair, running toward Mrs. Wilson, who had risen shakily from her bench. He threw his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder as she held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, sweetheart," Mrs. Wilson whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're home now." The room watched in silence, touched by the raw, unbreakable bond between the boy and his grandmother, a bond stronger than any words or decisions could ever convey. Judge Harris cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom, his tone firm yet understanding. "While I have decided that Tommy Wilson's best home is with his grandmother, Mrs. Wilson, I also recognize the Petersons' genuine desire to support him. Their resources, connections, and willingness to help can still play a vital role in his future." Mr. and Mrs. Peterson exchanged surprised but hopeful glances as the judge continued. "The court proposes that the Petersons take on a role as financial and educational sponsors for Tommy. This arrangement will allow Tommy to live with his grandmother while benefiting from the Petersons' ability to provide opportunities that might otherwise be out of reach." Mrs. Peterson nodded quickly, her expression softening. "We'd be honored to help in any way we can, Your Honor. We truly care about Tommy and want the best for him." Mr. Peterson leaned forward, his voice steady. "We can assist with his education, counseling, and any extracurricular activities he wishes to pursue. Our support will always be there without imposing on his life with his grandmother." Mrs. Wilson, holding Tommy close, wiped a tear from her cheek and looked at the Petersons. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "This means so much to us." The courtroom's tension eased as the arrangement was finalized, a compromise that ensured Tommy's love-filled home with his grandmother while providing additional support for his growth and future. Judge Harris leaned forward, addressing the court with a sense of purpose. "In light of Tommy Wilson's unique circumstances, this court recommends the establishment of a special support program to ensure his emotional, educational, and personal development needs are fully met." He turned to Mrs. Wilson. "This program will provide you with access to resources that can ease the challenges of raising Tommy. It includes financial assistance for his education, counseling services to help him process his loss, and community programs designed to foster his growth." The judge then directed his attention to the Petersons. "As part of this program, the Petersons have graciously agreed to act as sponsors. They will fund Tommy's enrollment in extracurricular activities, such as art classes or sports, and ensure he has access to high-quality educational tools." Mrs. Peterson nodded, her voice sincere. "We're happy to contribute. Tommy deserves every opportunity to thrive." The program also included bi-weekly visits from a dedicated social worker to provide guidance and monitor Tommy's progress. "This is not about intervention," the judge emphasized, but about support, ensuring Tommy's well-being in a way that honors his bond with his grandmother. The courtroom collectively exhaled, recognizing the program as a thoughtful solution, combining love, community, and opportunity for Tommy's future. Judge Harris leaned forward, addressing the court with a thoughtful expression. "Tommy's story reminds us that raising a child is not just the responsibility of one person, but often requires the support of a community. In this case, I recommend a collaborative approach, involving Mrs. Wilson's local community to ensure Tommy receives the care and opportunities he needs." Mrs. Wilson nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I've already spoken to my neighbors and friends from the church. They've offered to help, whether it's tutoring Tommy, driving him to appointments, or simply being there when we need support." The judge continued, turning to the Petersons. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, your willingness to contribute as sponsors demonstrates how individuals with resources can make a significant difference. Your support will complement the love and stability Mrs. Wilson provides." Mrs. Peterson smiled warmly. "We're ready to help however we can. We can fund extracurricular activities, provide educational resources, and ensure Tommy has access to the best opportunities." Community programs were also proposed, including mentorship from local volunteers and access to group counseling sessions for children experiencing loss. Together, the judge concluded, this collaboration will create a safety net for Tommy, a network of people who care deeply about his future. The courtroom felt lighter as the vision of shared responsibility unfolded, bringing together love, resources, and community to ensure Tommy's bright future. A soft golden light filtered through the small but cozy living room of Mrs. Wilson's apartment. The scent of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of lavender from a nearby candle. The room, though modest, radiated warmth. Family photographs lined the walls, including the cherished one of Tommy with his parents, now placed in a simple but elegant frame on the mantel. Tommy sat cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by his school books and a colorful drawing he was finishing for an art project. His face was relaxed, a content smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Nearby, Mrs. Wilson sat in her favorite armchair, knitting a scarf. Her hands moved with practiced ease, the clicking needles creating a gentle rhythm that filled the room. "Gran, look!" Tommy held up his drawing, a bright depiction of a family picnic under a sunny sky. "It's us, you, me, Mom, and Dad." Mrs. Wilson paused, her eyes softening as she took in the drawing. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with pride. She leaned forward to kiss the top of his head. "Your mom and dad would be so proud of you." On the small dining table, a new laptop, gifted by the Petersons, sat open. Tommy used it for schoolwork and occasional video calls with the Petersons, who had become a steady source of support. A calendar on the wall marked upcoming community events, including a Saturday art class Tommy was excited to attend. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Tommy climbed onto the couch next to Mrs. Wilson, leaning against her shoulder as she continued knitting. The apartment was quiet, filled only with the comforting sounds of home. No cameras, no performances, just love. For the first time in a long while, Tommy felt whole. He was home. In the quiet of Mrs. Wilson's living room, Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, his worn backpack resting in front of him. It had been with him through every foster home, every move, and every heartbreak. For months, he had clung to it like a lifeline, never letting anyone touch it. But now, for the first time, he unzipped it in the warmth of his grandmother's home. Carefully, he pulled out the faded scarf, his small hands smoothing its frayed edges. He brought it to his face, inhaling deeply, the familiar scent of lavender and cookies flooding his senses. Next, he retrieved the crumpled photograph of his parents, holding it gently as if it might break. He stared at their smiling faces, his lips curving into a soft smile. Mrs. Wilson knelt beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. "We'll keep these safe, sweetheart," she whispered. Tommy nodded, finally feeling ready to share his treasures. In the corner of Mrs. Wilson's small but cozy living room, a wooden shelf had been carefully arranged, a new addition she had lovingly created for Tommy. It wasn't large, but it was perfect, a small sanctuary dedicated to the memories of his family. The shelf stood beside the window, where the soft afternoon light illuminated its treasures. At the center sat the cherished photograph of Tommy with his parents, now displayed in a simple yet elegant frame. The edges of the photo, once crumpled, had been carefully smoothed out. Tommy had chosen the frame himself during a trip to the local store with Mrs. Wilson. "This one's nice," he had said, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "It feels like them." Next to the photo lay his mother's faded scarf, folded neatly, its familiar scent still lingering faintly in the threads. Mrs. Wilson had placed it in a small glass case to preserve it. "We'll keep it safe here, but you can take it out whenever you want," she had told him with a gentle smile. On another part of the shelf, a few of Tommy's drawings were displayed, bright, colorful pieces that spoke of hope and healing. One showed his family together at a picnic, with the sun shining down on them. Another depicted the apartment, small but filled with warmth and love. Tommy stood in front of the shelf, his fingers brushing the edges of the photo frame. Beside him, Mrs. Wilson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your mom and dad would be so proud of you," she said softly. "Do you think they'd like it?" Tommy asked, his voice quiet but hopeful. "They'd love it," she assured him. The shelf wasn't just a collection of items. It was a bridge between the past and the present, a reminder of love that could never be forgotten. Mrs. Wilson sat in her favorite armchair, the rhythmic clicking of her knitting needles filling the cozy living room. In her lap lay a half-finished scarf, soft and warm, in Tommy's favorite shades of blue. Her hands moved with practiced care, the yarn slipping between her fingers as she worked stitch by stitch. Tommy sat nearby, watching her with quiet fascination. "Is that for me, Gran?" he asked, his voice hopeful. She smiled, glancing up at him. "Of course, sweetheart. It's time you had a scarf of your own. But don't worry," she added, her eyes twinkling. "I'll make it just as special as your mom's." Tommy beamed, the warmth of her love wrapping around him even before the scarf was finished. The cozy apartment was alive with warmth as Tommy's laughter filled the room, a sound that seemed to make the walls glow brighter. He was sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by sheets of colored paper, markers, and glitter. He had just finished a drawing of Mrs. Wilson, complete with her knitting needles and a comically oversized ball of yarn. "Gran, look!" Tommy exclaimed, holding up his masterpiece. "This is you, but I made the yarn bigger than you." Mrs. Wilson chuckled from her armchair, her knitting resting in her lap as she admired his work. "Well, I suppose I am always surrounded by yarn," she teased, her voice light and full of joy. "But I think you forgot one thing." Tommy tilted his head, confused. "What?" "My cup of tea," she replied, her eyes sparkling with playful mischief. Tommy burst into laughter, rolling onto his back and clutching his stomach. The sound was pure and infectious, the kind of laughter that bubbles up from a place of unfiltered happiness. Mrs. Wilson joined in, her chuckles blending with his. For the first time in what felt like forever, Tommy's laughter wasn't rehearsed or restrained. It was free, real, and full of life. As the courtroom doors closed behind them, Tommy and Mrs. Wilson stepped into the crisp autumn air, the tension of the day melting away. Tommy glanced up at his grandmother, and before she could say a word, he wrapped his arms tightly around her waist. His head rested against her chest, and for the first time in months, he let out a deep, relieved breath. Mrs. Wilson knelt down, bringing herself to his eye level, and gently cupped his face with her hands. "You're home now, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her smile was radiant, filled with the purest joy. Tommy's own eyes welled up as he hugged her again, this time tighter. "I missed you, Gran," he said softly, his voice cracking. "Oh, Tommy," she murmured, stroking his hair. "I missed you too. Every single day." They stayed there for a moment, holding on to each other as if time had stopped. Around them, the world moved on, but in that embrace, it was just the two of them. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a return to love, safety, and the warm bond that had never been broken.